Welcome to PM Ready, your guide to becoming PMP certified. This is part 1 of the Introduction to the PMI Process Table. This lesson introduces you to the PMI Process Table. But to do that effectively, we first need to cover the PMI process groups and knowledge areas that are the framework of the process table. Then we'll take a brief look at the processes in each knowledge area and how they're organized by process group. Finally, we'll cover the framework of inputs, tools, and techniques and outputs that forms the basic structure of each of the individual project management processes in the process table. PMI has organized the project management process into 5 process groups. These are initiating, planning, executing, monitoring and controlling, and closing. As is suggested by the numbered order of these process groups on this slide, projects naturally go through these processes in this order, starting with initiating processes, moving on to full-scale planning processes, which result in the outputs needed for executing the project work, as well as monitoring and controlling the project, and ending with the project closing process group to neatly wrap up the project. Although these 5 process groups are in chronological order, they do overlap quite a bit, not only because one process group can start before the previous one is finished, but also because during the course of the project, it's often necessary to reapply or revisit previous processes, such as revisiting the planning processes in order to update the project management plan based on information from the, say, monitoring and controlling processes, or issues that arise during the executing processes. As you can see from this diagram that comes from the PMBOK guide, the level of effort spent in each of these process groups rises and falls in turn, but with significant overlap among the process groups. In particular, notice that the planning process group is a major component of the effort during most of the project, and that monitoring and controlling processes extend through the entire life cycle of the project. The Project Management Institute defines the initiating process group as the processes performed to define a new project or a new phase of an existing project by obtaining authorization to start the project or phase. Key points to notice here are, firstly, a new project or a new phase of an existing project. This is because projects may be divided into phases, and each phase will include all 5 process groups, starting with initiating processes and ending with closing processes. The second key point is that authorization to proceed with a project or phase is part of the initiating process group. PMI defines the planning process group as the processes required to establish the scope of the project, refine the objectives, and define the course of action required to attain the objectives that the project was undertaken to achieve. Key points to see here are established scope. In a traditional waterfall approach, the scope is defined up front. However, in an agile approach, the high-level scope may be established up front, but the details of the scope will be progressively elaborated during the execution of the project. Notice this term, progressive elaboration, which means to elaborate on the details of the scope throughout the project lifecycle. This may be because you start off with only a high-level description of the scope, or you may have some areas of scope that are well-defined while others are not so well-defined, or you may have the scope well-defined up front, but discover the need for changes during the execution of the project. Another phrase to notice is refine the objectives. The objectives are defined during the initiating processes, but may be refined during planning, whether planning is conducted mostly up front or during the life of the project. Another phrase to notice is define the course of action. This is a deceptively simple statement that actually represents a great deal of planning of the project schedule, costs, quality, resources, procurement, risk management, communications, and stakeholder engagement. The executing process group is defined by PMI as the processes performed to complete the work defined in the project management plan to satisfy the project requirements. As with the planning process group, this may look like a simple statement, but it represents quite a bit of work across several knowledge areas in order to complete the work laid out in the project management plan and satisfy the project requirements. To help you distinguish this process group from the monitoring and controlling process group, think of the executing process group as a group of processes that work on what the project is meant to deliver. The monitoring and controlling process group is defined as the processes required to track, review, and regulate the progress and performance of the project, identify any areas in which changes to the plan are required, and initiate the corresponding changes. To help you distinguish between the monitoring and controlling process group and the executing process group, notice that monitoring and controlling is not about creating the deliverables of the project that the key stakeholders are expecting. Instead, it's about keeping an eye on the work, tracking progress, reviewing performance, identifying opportunities for improvement, initiating changes, and everything that has to do with making sure that the work is being done well. It's not about doing the work, it's about making sure it is done right and adapting to changing circumstances. There are a number of processes in the PMI process table that are easily confused between the executing process group and the monitoring and controlling process group, particularly as these processes are performed simultaneously. Remembering that executing is about doing the work, and monitoring and controlling is about keeping an eye on the work and the circumstances will help you to distinguish among these processes and better navigate your projects, not to mention the PMP exam. The closing process group is all about closing the project in an orderly fashion, whether the project is being completed, terminated, or put on hold. An important exception is that closing procurements contracts is not part of the closing process group. In earlier versions of the PMBOK guide and the project management standard, it was part of the closing process group. However, starting with the 6th edition, closing contracts is part of the control procurements process, which is, as you've guessed, in the monitoring and controlling process group. The project management processes are organized into 10 knowledge areas, covering integration, scope, schedule, cost, quality, resource, communications, risk, procurement, and stakeholder. Some projects may need other knowledge areas, but these are the 10 that are used on most projects most of the time. Let's briefly go through the definitions of each of these knowledge areas. The first is project integration management, which includes the processes and activities to identify, define, combine, unify, and coordinate the various processes and project management activities within the project management process groups. In other words, this is the knowledge area that oversees, encompasses, and controls all of the processes of the other 9 knowledge areas. Keep in mind that this is not about the integration of systems or components that the project is building, but rather it's about the integration of the project management processes. Project scope management includes the processes required to ensure that the project includes all the work required and only the work required to complete the project successfully. Notice the wording here. It needs to include everything that needs to be done and only what needs to be done. This is very different from the concept of under-promise and over-deliver. In project management, we don't want to over-deliver. We want to deliver exactly what's required, nothing more and nothing less. Project schedule management includes the processes required to manage the timely completion of the project. That is, for the project to be completed on time. Project cost management includes the processes involved in planning, estimating, budgeting, also financing, funding, and managing and controlling costs so that the project can be completed within the approved budget. Project quality management includes the processes for incorporating the organization's quality policy regarding planning, managing, and controlling project and product quality requirements in order to meet stakeholders' expectations. Notice here a couple of interesting points. One is that it refers to the organization's quality policy. This is important in quality management, that you don't come up with your quality requirements in a vacuum. You have to consult with what your organization's quality policies are, and that may also include consulting your industry's quality standards. Also notice that it refers not only to quality relative to the product, but also to the project. So quality management is not only about building a quality product, but also in the quality of how well you manage a project. Project resource management includes the processes to identify, acquire, and manage the resources needed for the successful completion of the project. Now, this includes both people and physical resources, and there are processes to manage each of those. Project communications management includes the processes required to ensure timely and appropriate planning, collection, creation, distribution, storage, retrieval, management, control, monitoring, and ultimate disposition of project information. That is quite a long list because there is a lot to consider in communications management. Project risk management includes the processes of conducting risk management planning, identification, analysis, response planning, response implementation, and monitoring risk on a project. We'll get into this more later in the course, but notice the emphasis on response planning and implementation. Risk is not something that we address passively. Risk is something that we actively manage. Project procurement management includes the processes necessary to purchase or acquire products, services, or results needed from outside the project team. This is about working with outside vendors or sellers to get parts of the project or all of the project done. Project stakeholder management includes the processes required to identify the people, groups, or organizations that could impact or be impacted by the project, to analyze stakeholder expectations and their impact on the project, and to develop appropriate management strategies for effectively engaging stakeholders in project decisions and execution. Again, notice how proactive this statement is. How many of the 10 knowledge areas can you remember? Take a moment and think about it. And here they are. For me, it's easiest to remember them in this order: integration, scope, schedule, cost, quality, resource, communications, risk, procurement, and stakeholder, because this is the order in which they are found in the PMBOK guide. You can find all of the processes mapped out by process group and knowledge area in a table found on page 25 of the PMBOK guide. It's a rather large table that doesn't fit very well on a single slide. Here's a closer look, but it still doesn't fit well on just one slide, so we'll go through them briefly in the next several slides. Don't worry, I know it's an intimidating amount of information packed into this table. You don't need to know it all right now. This course will go through each of these processes in detail by process group and by knowledge area, learning what each one is for and how they all interrelate. This is not a table you should try to memorize. It's a reference and a guide to understanding the processes. You don't need to memorize them in order to be quite successful at managing projects and to pass the PMP exam. The key is to understand them, which we'll cover in this course. We'll also go through them in roughly the order that you would use them in an actual process. That will make it easier to understand them and to remember them. We start with the initiating process group. It has just 2 processes, but they are critical to get the project off to the right start. One is the Develop Project Charter process, and the other is the Identify Stakeholders process. They are closely related and should both be done at the same time. You can't develop the project charter first and put off Identify Stakeholders until afterwards. You have to know at least the key stakeholders in order to create a good, high-level description of the project in the project charter. Similarly, you can't identify stakeholders and put off Develop Project Charter until afterwards. You have to know something about the scope of the project in order to identify the key stakeholders who will be affected by the project and who needs to be involved in the project. You'll probably start with the Develop Project Charter process, but will need to also identify stakeholders as soon as possible in order to finish the project charter. Then you can finish identifying other stakeholders, but you may discover another key stakeholder whose input affects the project charter. As you can see, this is iterative, going back and forth between the 2 processes. This is the case for all of the project management processes. You don't just do it one time, finish it, and move on. Even if you tried to, you'd end up having to come back to what you thought was finished. So it's best to understand up front that project management processes are iterative in nature and that you'll revisit processes as needed throughout the project lifecycle. The planning process group has at least one planning process in each of the 10 knowledge areas. You'll notice that the 10 knowledge areas listed here are not shown in the same order as they're found in the process table. This is because I've put them in the order in which they most often are started. Integration is at the top because it is the knowledge area that encompasses and coordinates all of the other knowledge areas. Stakeholder engagement and communications are next because you need to start by working with the stakeholders to define the scope of the project. The rest are listed in the order they're found in the process table, which is more or less the order in which you would address them on most projects. Keeping in mind that planning is iterative, and many of the planning processes will be done in parallel. Next comes the executing process group and the monitoring and controlling process group. Executing processes begin as soon as the planning is done enough to kick off the project and start creating the project deliverables. Monitoring and controlling processes will start at the same time or sooner, depending on the project and the organization. Monitoring and controlling can be applied to the processes of initiating and planning as well, measuring and reporting on how well these project processes are going. Notice that the executing processes do not include the scope, schedule, or cost knowledge areas. This is because these areas are managed by the Direct and Manage Project Work process, which is in the Integration knowledge area. On the other hand, each knowledge area includes at least one monitoring and controlling process. This concludes Part 1 of the Introduction to the PMI Process Table. PM Ready is a publication of PM Guaranteed and is based on the Project Management Institute's PMBOK guide.